Sarah Martinez had grown used to being invisible. At 28, she had collected more rejection letters than most people collect birthday cards. Her family called her the dreamer who never delivered. Her college professors had labeled her work mediocre at best. Even her own mother would sigh and ask when she planned to get serious about life. But sometimes, the universe has a different plan. Sometimes the person everyone counts out is exactly the one who changes everything. Sometimes, the phone call that interrupts your ordinary Tuesday morning training session is the call that proves every doubter wrong. Sometimes being labeled useless is just the beginning of a story that will leave everyone speechless. This is the true story of how one woman went from being the family disappointment to receiving a phone call from the President of the United States. A call that would not only shock her critics but transform her into the hero nobody saw coming. Sarah Martinez pulled her worn sneakers tighter as she walked through the doors of the community center. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the empty hallways. It was 6 a.m. on a Tuesday, and she was already running late for her emergency response training session. The instructor, Mr. Thompson, didn't tolerate lateness, especially from someone like her. Someone like her. Those words had followed Sarah her entire life. Born into a family of high achievers in Denver, Colorado, she had always been the odd one out. Her older brother Marcus was a successful lawyer, her younger sister Elena was finishing medical school with honors, and her parents ran a thriving accounting firm. Then there was Sarah, the middle child who seemed to stumble through life without direction or purpose. Her father, Roberto Martinez, had built his business from nothing after immigrating from Mexico in the 1980s. He was a man who believed in hard work, concrete results, and practical decisions. When Sarah announced she wanted to study emergency management in college, he had shaken his head in disappointment. Emergency management, he had said, is that even a real career? Why not something stable like accounting or law? Her mother, Patricia, had been more gentle but equally skeptical. Mija, you've started so many things and never finished them. Remember when you wanted to be a veterinarian or a teacher? Or that phase when you thought you'd become a professional photographer? Patricia would list these abandoned dreams like items on a grocery list, each one another piece of evidence that Sarah couldn't stick to anything long enough to succeed. The pattern had continued through college. Sarah switched majors 3 times before settling on emergency management, graduated with a barely acceptable GPA, and then spent the next 6 years bouncing between various jobs that never seemed to lead anywhere. She worked as a dispatcher for 901 calls, then as an administrative assistant at a local fire department, then briefly as a safety coordinator for a construction company before being laid off due to budget cuts. Each job loss brought the same conversation at family dinners. Maybe it's time to be realistic, her brother Marcus would say, cutting his steak with surgical precision. I could probably get you an entry-level position at my firm. Nothing fancy, just filing and organizing documents, but it's steady work. Elena would nod in agreement, adding, or I could ask around at the hospital. They always need people for administrative work. Sarah would sit there pushing food around her plate, feeling smaller with each well-intentioned suggestion. They meant well, she knew that. But their version of helping felt like giving up on everything she had ever wanted to become. The problem was, she wasn't entirely sure what that was anymore. The community center training program had been her latest attempt to find direction. The Emergency Response Volunteer Training was a 6-month course that covered everything from basic first aid to disaster coordination. It wasn't paid, and it wouldn't lead directly to a job, but it was something Sarah felt drawn to in a way she hadn't experienced in years. The program attracted an interesting mix of people. There were retired folks who wanted to give back to their community, college students looking to build their resumes, and people like Sarah, who were searching for something they couldn't quite name. The instructor, Tom Thompson, was a former FEMA coordinator who had worked disaster relief operations across the country. He was tough, demanding, and had little patience for people who weren't serious about the work. From the beginning, Sarah had struggled to prove herself. During their first training exercise, a simulated building collapse scenario, she had frozen up when asked to coordinate the rescue teams. Her mind had gone blank as 20 pairs of eyes stared at her, waiting for instructions. The silence stretched on until Thompson finally called for someone else to take over. Martinez, he had said afterward, pulling her aside. This work isn't for everyone. It requires quick thinking, leadership abilities, and the capacity to handle pressure. I'm not sure you have what it takes. Those words had hit harder than any family criticism. At least her family's doubts came from love and concern. Thompson's assessment was purely professional, and it confirmed her worst fears about herself. Maybe she really was useless. Maybe everyone had been right all along. But Sarah had stubbornly refused to quit. She showed up every Tuesday and Thursday morning, endured the critical looks and disappointed sighs, and slowly began to improve. She studied emergency protocols until she could recite them in her sleep. She practiced radio communications at home, using an old walkie-talkie she had bought at a garage sale. She read disaster response case studies during her lunch breaks at her current job as a part-time receptionist at a dental office. The other trainees began to notice her dedication, even if Thompson remained skeptical. Maria Santos, a retired nurse in her 60s, often sat with Sarah during breaks. "You remind me of myself when I first started nursing," she would say. "I wasn't the smartest or the fastest, but I was the most stubborn. Sometimes that's what matters most." James Park, a college senior studying environmental science, appreciated how thoroughly Sarah approached every assignment. "You actually read all the supplemental materials," he observed one morning. "Most of us just skim through them, but you take notes like you're studying for the bar exam." These small encouragements kept Sarah going, but they couldn't completely silence the voice in her head that sounded suspiciously like her father asking when she would get serious about life. The voice that sounded like her mother listing all her abandoned dreams. The voice that sounded like Thompson questioning whether she had what it takes. The turning point came during their 4th month of training. They were practicing evacuation procedures when news broke about a major earthquake in California. As they watched the coverage on the community center's old television, Sarah found herself analyzing the response coordination, identifying potential bottlenecks in the rescue efforts, and mentally organizing how she would approach the logistics if she were in charge. "You're doing it again," James said, watching her scribble notes on a napkin. "Doing what?" "That thing where you see 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Look around. Everyone else is just watching the news, but you're trying to solve their problems from 2,000 miles away." Sarah looked down at her napkin, covered with diagrams and lists she had created without even realizing it. Maybe James was right. Maybe she did see things differently than other people. But was that enough to overcome a lifetime of being labeled as someone who didn't have what it takes? The answer would come sooner than she expected, in the form of a phone call that would change not just her life, but her understanding of what she was truly capable of achieving. But first, she had to survive one more training session where everyone expected her to fail, including herself. As she pushed through the community center doors that Tuesday morning, Sarah had no idea that in just 3 hours, her phone would ring with the most important call of her life. She had no idea that all those years of feeling useless were about to be revealed as preparation for a moment when her country would need exactly the skills everyone had dismissed as worthless. She only knew that she was tired of being the person everyone expected to fail, and she was determined to prove them wrong, even if she wasn't entirely sure how. The morning training session was going particularly badly. Sarah had been assigned to lead a tabletop exercise, simulating a multi-car accident with chemical spill complications, and she was struggling to coordinate the various response teams. Thompson watched from the corner of the room, his arms crossed and his expression growing more disappointed by the minute. "Martinez, you need to prioritize," he called out as Sarah fumbled through her notes. "What's the immediate threat to public safety?" Sarah's mind raced through the scenario details. Multiple casualties, unknown chemical exposure, traffic backed up for miles, and emergency services stretched thin across the city. She knew the right answer was somewhere in her preparation materials, but under the pressure of Thompson's scrutiny and the expectant faces of her fellow trainees, the information seemed to slip away. The chemical containment should be," she started, then stopped. That wasn't right. The casualties came first, always. But what about the exposure risk to the first responders? "Time's up," Thompson announced. "Johnson, take over." David Johnson, a former military medic who never seemed to struggle with these exercises, smoothly stepped into the leadership role. Within minutes, he had organized the response teams, established a clear chain of command, and begun addressing each aspect of the crisis in logical order. Sarah watched from the sidelines, feeling the familiar sting of inadequacy. During the break, Maria Santos approached her with 2 cups of coffee from the machine in the hallway. "Don't let it get to you, mija," she said, using the same term of endearment Sarah's mother used. "These exercises are designed to trip people up. Half the battle is learning to trust your instincts." "What if my instincts are wrong?" Sarah asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Then you learn from the mistake and do better next time. That's how this works." Maria settled into the plastic chair next to Sarah. "You know, I've been doing volunteer work for 30 years, and I've seen a lot of people come and go. The ones who last aren't always the ones who seem most prepared at the beginning." Before Sarah could ask what she meant, Thompson called them back for the next exercise. This one was even more complex, a simulated tornado outbreak affecting multiple counties, with communication systems down and resources scattered across a wide area. Sarah volunteered to participate but not lead, hoping to observe and learn from someone more experienced. The scenario was based on a real event that had occurred in Alabama 3 years earlier. Thompson had worked that disaster personally, and his description of the chaos and confusion was vivid and unsettling. "When you're dealing with something this scale," he explained, "your textbook solutions go out the window. You have to adapt, improvise, and make decisions with incomplete information." As the exercise progressed, Sarah found herself taking notes not just on the official responses being practiced, but on the gaps she noticed. The coordination between different agencies seemed inefficient. The resource allocation didn't account for geographic barriers created by the storm damage. The communication protocols would break down if the primary systems failed. She started sketching alternative approaches on the back of her handout, creating flowcharts and backup systems that could address the problems she was identifying. She was so absorbed in this process that she barely noticed when her phone began buzzing in her bag. The first buzz she ignored. The second and third got her attention, but she was in the middle of a training exercise, and Thompson had strict rules about phone usage. By the fourth buzz, Maria was tapping her on the shoulder. "Maybe you should check that," Maria whispered. "Could be an emergency." Sarah glanced at Thompson, who was deeply engaged in explaining evacuation procedures to another group. She quietly pulled her phone from her bag and saw 7 missed calls from the same unknown number. As she stared at the screen, it began ringing again. She stepped into the hallway as quietly as possible and answered. "Hello? Is this Sarah Martinez?" The voice was professional, authoritative, with the kind of formal tone that suggested official business. "Yes, this is Sarah. Ms. Martinez. This is David Chen from the White House Emergency Response Team. I need to speak with you immediately about a developing situation." Sarah's first thought was that this had to be a prank. Her brother Marcus was always playing elaborate jokes, and this seemed like exactly the kind of thing he would orchestrate. "I'm sorry, who is this?" "Ma'am, I understand your skepticism, but this is a legitimate call. We've been trying to reach you for the past 20 minutes. Are you currently in Denver?" The man provided details that would have been difficult to fake: her exact address, her emergency management background, even the fact that she was currently in training at the Stapleton Community Center. Sarah's skepticism began to give way to confusion and then to a growing sense of urgency. "There's been a significant incident at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation in Washington State," Chen continued. "We have reason to believe it may not have been accidental, and we need someone with your specific expertise to assist with the response coordination." "My expertise?" Sarah almost laughed. "I think you have the wrong person. I'm not an expert in anything. I'm just taking a volunteer training class." "Ms. Martinez, we're aware of your background. We know about your undergraduate thesis on nuclear facility emergency protocols. We know about the analysis you submitted to FEMA regarding the coordination failures during the Fukushima response. We know about the recommendations you made following the chemical plant explosion in Texas last year." Sarah was stunned. She had indeed written all of those things, but they were just academic exercises, papers she had submitted to professors or agencies without any expectation that they would be taken seriously. Her undergraduate thesis had been dismissed by her advisor as overly ambitious for someone without field experience. The FEMA analysis had been submitted online and had never received a response. The Texas recommendations had been sent to local authorities who had never acknowledged receiving them. "You remember those?" she asked weakly. We remember them, and more importantly, we've reviewed them. Your analysis of the Fukushima coordination failures was remarkably prescient. Your recommendations for improving interagency communication protocols were exactly what we ended up implementing after the Texas incident. Ms. Martinez, you may not realize it, but you've been on our radar for some time. Sarah sank into one of the plastic chairs lining the hallway. This conversation was surreal, but Chen's knowledge of her work was too detailed to be fake. What exactly are you asking me to do? We need you to come to Washington immediately. We're coordinating the response to the Hanford incident, but we're facing exactly the kind of communication and logistics challenges you've analyzed in your previous work. The President specifically requested that we bring you in as a consultant. The President knows who I am? Ma'am, the President has read your work. He was particularly impressed with your analysis of cascading failure scenarios in critical infrastructure. Right now, we're dealing with a situation that could affect millions of people, and we need someone who understands how these systems can fail and what we can do to prevent that from happening. Sarah looked through the window into the training room, where her fellow volunteers were still working through the tornado exercise. Thompson was demonstrating proper radio protocol, and James was taking notes with the same intensity Sarah usually brought to her studies. It felt like she was looking at her life from the outside, watching the person she had been just minutes before. I need to think about this, she said finally. Ma'am, with respect, we don't have time for thinking. We have a plane waiting at Denver International Airport, and we need you in Washington within 4 hours. Every minute we delay potentially puts more people at risk. But I'm not qualified. I've never actually managed a real emergency. I've never coordinated anything more complex than a training exercise, and I can't even do that properly. Chen's voice softened slightly. Ms. Martinez, competence isn't always about experience. Sometimes it's about being able to see patterns that others miss, to identify problems before they become catastrophic, and to think systematically about complex challenges. Based on your written work, you've demonstrated all of those abilities. What you haven't had is the opportunity to apply them. Through the window, Sarah could see Thompson calling the group back together. The morning session was ending, and soon the volunteers would be packing up their materials and heading back to their regular lives. She thought about her job at the dental office, where she answered phones and scheduled appointments. She thought about her family's expectations that she would eventually settle for something practical and stable. She thought about all the times she had been told she wasn't ready, wasn't qualified, didn't have what it takes. If I do this, she said slowly, what happens if I fail? What happens if I make the wrong decisions and people get hurt because of it? Miss Martinez, people are already at risk. We're asking you to help us minimize that risk, not to eliminate it entirely. Nobody expects perfection. We just need your analytical skills and your understanding of how complex systems can fail. Sarah closed her eyes and made a decision that would change her life forever. Okay, I'll do it. What do I need to do? A car is already on its way to pick you up. Gather whatever materials you might need and be ready to leave in 15 minutes. We'll brief you fully on the plane. As Sarah hung up the phone, she realized she was shaking. Not with fear, exactly, but with a combination of terror and excitement that she had never experienced before. For the first time in her life, someone was asking her to do exactly what she was good at, even if she hadn't realized she was good at it. She walked back into the training room, where Thompson was dismissing the group for the day. Martinez, he called as she gathered her things. You need to work on your decision-making under pressure. This afternoon's scenario will be even more challenging. Actually, Mr. Thompson, I won't be here this afternoon, Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Doctor's appointment? No, sir. I'm going to Washington. The President needs my help with an emergency response situation. Thompson stared at her for a long moment, clearly assuming she was joking. When he realized she was serious, his expression shifted from skepticism to something that might have been respect. Well then, he said finally, I guess we'll see what you're really made of. As Sarah walked toward the exit, she passed Maria, who squeezed her shoulder encouragingly. Trust your instincts, mija, the older woman whispered. I think you're about to surprise a lot of people. Outside, a black sedan was already waiting. As Sarah climbed into the back seat, she thought about all the times she had been called useless, all the opportunities she had been told she wasn't ready for, all the dreams her family had dismissed as unrealistic. In 3 hours, she would be briefing the President of the United States. The person everyone had labeled as never quite good enough was about to discover just how much she was capable of achieving. The private jet was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. Leather seats, multiple screens displaying real-time data feeds, and a conference table where 3 serious-looking officials were already deep in conversation when she boarded. David Chen, the man who had called her, was younger than she had expected, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of intense focus that suggested he rarely slept. "Miss Martinez, thank you for coming," he said, standing to shake her hand. "Let me introduce you to the team. This is Director Janet Walsh from FEMA, Colonel Mike Rodriguez from the Army Corps of Engineers, and Dr. Lisa Park from the Department of Energy." Each of them greeted Sarah with professional courtesy, but she could sense their skepticism. She was wearing jeans and a community center volunteer t-shirt, carrying a backpack full of training materials, and she probably looked exactly like what she was. Someone who had been pulled out of a beginner's emergency response class to advise the federal government. "Before we get into the specifics," Director Walsh said, settling back into her seat as the plane began to taxi, "I want you to understand the scope of what we're dealing with. The Hanford site contains more nuclear waste than any other location in the United States. We're talking about 53 million gallons of high-level radioactive and chemical waste stored in underground tanks." Sarah nodded, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. She was familiar with Hanford from her academic research, but reading about nuclear waste storage was very different from being responsible for responding to an actual crisis involving it. Colonel Rodriguez opened a laptop and turned it toward her. "At approximately 0800 Pacific time this morning, sensors detected a significant breach in tank AY-102. Initial estimates suggest we're looking at a leak of potentially 50,000 gallons of high-level waste." "That's terrible," Sarah said, studying the data on the screen. "But I don't understand why this requires this level of response. Tank leaks have happened before at Hanford, and they were handled through standard protocols." Dr. Park exchanged a look with Chen before responding. "That's where this situation becomes more complex. We have reason to believe this wasn't an accident. Security footage shows unauthorized personnel in the area 3 days ago. We found evidence of tampered monitoring equipment, and the pattern of the breach suggests it was deliberately caused." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the plane's air conditioning. "You're saying someone intentionally caused a nuclear waste leak? That's what we're trying to determine," Chen said. "But whether it was accidental or intentional, we now have a crisis that could affect the entire Pacific Northwest. The Columbia River is less than 5 miles from the breach site. If the contamination reaches the groundwater system, we're looking at an environmental disaster that could affect millions of people." Director Walsh pulled up a map showing the potential contamination zone. "Using current weather patterns and groundwater flow models, we estimate we have 72 hours before the contamination could reach the river system. After that, our response options become much more limited and much more expensive." Sarah studied the map, her mind automatically beginning to analyze the logistics involved. "What's the current response plan?" Colonel Rodriguez opened a thick folder filled with official protocols. "Standard procedure calls for immediate containment at the source, evacuation of personnel from the affected areas, and coordination with state and local authorities for potential civilian evacuations if the contamination spreads." "What about alternative water sources for the communities that depend on the Columbia River?" Sarah asked. "That would be handled by state authorities according to their emergency management protocols," Director Walsh replied. Sarah frowned, remembering her analysis of the Texas chemical plant disaster. In Texas, the coordination between federal and state authorities broke down because everyone assumed someone else was handling the long-term impacts on local communities. By the time they realized the gaps in coverage, it was too late to implement effective solutions. Dr. Park leaned forward with interest. "What would you do differently?" This was the moment Sarah had been dreading and anticipating since Chen's phone call. Everyone was looking at her, waiting for her to provide insights that would justify her presence on this plane. She thought about Thompson's criticism of her decision-making under pressure, about her family's doubts about her abilities, about all the time she had frozen up when people were depending on her. But then she looked at the data again, and something clicked. The patterns she had studied in her academic work were all there. The coordination challenges, the communication gaps, the cascade of secondary effects that could turn a serious incident into a catastrophic disaster. For the first time in her life, she was looking at a real-world situation that matched exactly what she had been analyzing and preparing for. even if she hadn't realized that's what she was doing. The standard protocols are designed for accidental leaks, she said slowly, her confidence building as she spoke. They assume the source of the problem is contained and that we're dealing with damage control. But if this was intentional, we have to consider the possibility that it's not just about this one tank. Colonel Rodriguez sat up straighter. What do you mean? Sarah pulled out her notebook and began sketching a diagram. If I wanted to cause maximum disruption with minimal resources, I wouldn't just breach one tank. I'd time the breach to coincide with other factors that would complicate the response. What's the weather forecast for the next 72 hours? Chen checked his tablet. Heavy rain expected starting tomorrow afternoon. Rain accelerates groundwater movement and makes containment much more difficult, Sarah said, adding notes to her diagram. What about staffing levels at Hanford this week? Dr. Park checked her own device. We're operating with reduced personnel due to budget constraints, and several key technical specialists are attending a conference in Atlanta. Sarah nodded grimly. And what major events are scheduled in the region that might complicate evacuation or emergency response? The silence that followed was telling. Finally, Director Walsh spoke up. There's a major university graduation ceremony in Portland tomorrow, and several outdoor festivals scheduled for the weekend. We're looking at potentially 200,000 additional people in the affected area. This wasn't random, Sarah said with growing certainty. Someone studied our response capabilities and chose the optimal time to cause maximum disruption, which means we can't rely on standard protocols because they're based on assumptions that don't apply to this situation. Colonel Rodriguez was taking notes now. What would you recommend? Sarah felt a familiar surge of the analytical clarity that had always made her feel like she understood complex systems better than the people around her. But this time, instead of being dismissed as overthinking or impractical analysis, her insights were being welcomed and valued. First, we need to assume there may be additional breaches planned or already in progress. Someone should be conducting a comprehensive security sweep of all storage areas at Hanford, not just the immediate vicinity of the known breach. Dr. Park was already reaching for her phone. I'll coordinate that with site security. Second, we can't wait for the contamination to reach the river before implementing water system contingencies. We need to start coordinating alternative water sources for affected communities right now, while we still have time to do it systematically rather than reactively. Director Walsh nodded. That makes sense. What else? Sarah was warming to the task now, her mind racing through the cascade of interconnected challenges she could see developing. We need to rethink our communication strategy. If this was intentional, whoever did it probably wants to create panic and confusion. Our public messaging needs to be proactive and comprehensive, not just reactive damage control. Chen looked impressed. You've thought about this kind of scenario before. I've thought about all kinds of scenarios, Sarah admitted. It's just that nobody ever asked me to apply that thinking to real situations before. Colonel Rodriguez closed his protocol manual. Forget the standard responses. Walk us through how you would coordinate this entire operation. Sarah took a deep breath and began outlining a comprehensive approach that drew on everything she had learned from studying past disasters, everything she had analyzed about coordination failures, and every insight she had developed about how complex systems could be protected from cascading failures. As she spoke, she could see the team's skepticism giving way to recognition and respect. These were highly experienced professionals who had managed major crises before, but they were approaching this situation through the lens of their existing protocols and procedures. Sarah was approaching it as a unique challenge that required adaptive solutions. The key is thinking systematically about all the ways this situation could get worse, and then building redundant safeguards to prevent those outcomes, she explained. We can't just focus on containing the immediate leak. We have to consider the economic impacts, the public health implications, the political ramifications, and the possibility that this is just the first phase of a larger attack. Dr. Park looked up from her phone where she had been taking detailed notes. I've never heard anyone frame emergency response in quite these terms before. Where did you learn to think like this? I don't know, Sarah said honestly. I've always been able to see the connections between different parts of complex systems. It's just that most people told me I was overthinking things. Director Walsh smiled for the first time since Sarah had boarded the plane. In this situation, overthinking might be exactly what we need. As the plane began its descent toward Washington, Sarah realized that the crushing self-doubt she had carried for years was beginning to give way to something she had never experienced before, confidence based not on other people's approval, but on her own growing understanding of what she was capable of achieving. She was about to walk into the White House to brief the President of the United States on one of the most serious environmental crises in recent memory. The person her family considered a perpetual disappointment was about to prove that sometimes being different isn't the same thing as being useless. But first, she had to survive the next few hours without making any mistakes that could put millions of people at risk. No pressure at all. The Emergency Operations Center had been transformed overnight into Sarah's command headquarters. Multiple screens displayed real-time data from Hanford, weather systems, traffic patterns, and communication intercepts. Representatives from a dozen different agencies sat at workstations, all taking direction from the woman who 12 hours earlier had been struggling through a community center training exercise. Sarah hadn't slept, but adrenaline and the clarity that came from finally being in her element kept her sharp and focused. Her predictions from the previous evening had proven accurate. 2 additional tanks had been compromised, and the unauthorized communication signals suggested someone was indeed monitoring their response efforts. "Status report," she called out to her team. In the past 10 hours, she had learned to project authority in a way that felt natural rather than forced. These were experienced professionals, who could have easily dismissed her as inexperienced, but her systematic approach and accurate predictions had quickly earned their respect. Agent Maria Santos, no relation to the Maria from her training class, though the name connection had made Sarah smile, looked up from her workstation. "We've isolated the communication intercepts to a location approximately 8 miles from the facility. FBI tactical teams are moving into position." Colonel Rodriguez, who had been skeptical on the plane but was now one of Sarah's strongest supporters, provided the engineering update. "The innovative containment approach you designed is working better than projected. We've stopped the spread from the primary leak site, and the secondary barriers are holding." Park nodded approvingly from her position coordinating with the Department of Energy. The proactive evacuation of vulnerable populations began 4 hours ago, ahead of schedule. "We've relocated 15,000 people from the potential impact zone, and they're being housed in facilities that were prepared in advance rather than set up reactively." Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction, but she couldn't allow herself to celebrate yet. "What's the status on the Columbia River protection protocols?" Director Walsh, who was coordinating with state and local authorities, consulted her tablet. "Alternative water sources are operational in all affected communities. If the contamination reaches the river system, we'll be able to maintain clean water supplies for 2.3 million people indefinitely while we implement remediation procedures." This was the moment Sarah allowed herself a brief smile. Every major element of her comprehensive response plan was working exactly as she had designed it. The systematic analysis that had always made her seem like she was overthinking simple problems had proven to be exactly the right approach for managing a crisis of this complexity. "Incoming communication from the field teams," Agent Santos announced. "They've located what appears to be a mobile command center with sophisticated monitoring equipment. Multiple suspects in custody." Sarah moved to the central console and opened a secure communication channel. "Field Team Alpha, this is Emergency Command. What can you tell us about the suspects and their equipment?" The voice that came back was calm and professional. "Command, we've apprehended 4 individuals with extensive technical backgrounds in nuclear engineering and cyber warfare. Their equipment was sophisticated enough to monitor not just our communication frequencies but our internal coordination protocols." Colonel Rodriguez looked grim. "That confirms your analysis about this being a test of our response capabilities. What else did they learn from monitoring us?" Sarah asked the field team. "Unknown at this time, but their equipment recorded everything we did for the first 6 hours of the response. After that, your alternative communication protocols prevented them from gathering additional intelligence." Sarah felt a chill at the implications. If her unconventional response hadn't disrupted their monitoring capabilities, the perpetrators would have gained a complete understanding of how the federal government coordinated major emergency responses. That information could have been used to plan much more devastating attacks in the future. "Field Team Alpha, I need you to secure all their equipment and data storage devices for analysis. We need to understand what they learned and what they might have shared with other parties." Understood, Command. Equipment secured and transport arranged. Dr. Biasiles. Park looked up from her workstation with an expression of amazement. Sarah, do you realize what you've accomplished here? You didn't just coordinate an effective response to this crisis. You identified and neutralized an intelligence-gathering operation that could have compromised national security for years to come. Before Sarah could respond, her secure phone rang with a call from the White House. Ms. Martinez, this is President Hayes. I've been monitoring your coordination efforts, and I wanted to personally congratulate you on an exceptional performance under extraordinary circumstances. Thank you, Mr. President. The situation is stabilized, but we'll need continued monitoring for the next 48 hours to ensure there are no additional complications. Understood. I also wanted to let you know that I've been in contact with the director of FEMA. We'd like to offer you a permanent position coordinating our national emergency response capabilities. Sarah paused, suddenly aware that this phone call was about to change the trajectory of her entire life. Sir, I'm honored by the offer, but I want to make sure you understand my background. I don't have the traditional qualifications that would normally be expected for this type of position. President Hayes chuckled. Ms. Martinez, in the last 12 hours, you've demonstrated capabilities that most people with traditional qualifications never develop. You saw patterns that experienced professionals missed. You designed solutions that weren't in any protocol manual. You coordinated a response that not only addressed the immediate crisis, but anticipated and prevented future complications. But, sir, no buts, Ms. Martinez. Sometimes the best person for a job is the one who approaches it differently than everyone else. Your systematic thinking and ability to see connections others miss are exactly what we need in someone responsible for national emergency preparedness. After Sarah accepted the president's offer and ended the call, she found herself standing in the middle of the operations center, surrounded by people who had just watched her prove that everything they thought they knew about qualifications and expertise needed to be reconsidered. Agent Santos approached her with a knowing smile. You know, when I first saw you walk in here yesterday, I thought someone had made a mistake. You looked like someone who'd been pulled out of a training class, not someone who belonged in a national security briefing. That's exactly what I was, Sarah admitted. But you handled this crisis better than most people with decades of experience would have. How? Sarah considered the question seriously. I think it's because I never learned that certain approaches were wrong or impractical. I've always approached complex problems systematically, looking for patterns and connections. Most people told me I was overthinking things, so I learned to trust my own analysis rather than deferring to conventional wisdom. Colonel Rodriguez joined the conversation. That's exactly why you succeeded here. The perpetrators had studied our conventional approaches and planned around them. When you abandoned standard protocols and designed adaptive responses, you created variables they hadn't prepared for. Dr. Prosemos, Park nodded in agreement. You turned your supposed weakness, overthinking everything, into the strength that solved an unprecedented crisis. As the immediate crisis operations began winding down and normal monitoring procedures resumed, Sarah found herself thinking about the phone call she needed to make to her family. Just 24 hours earlier, her father had been asking when she would get serious about life. Her mother had been listing all her abandoned dreams as evidence that she couldn't stick to anything long enough to succeed. Her siblings had been offering her entry-level positions doing filing and administrative work. Now she needed to tell them that the President of the United States had personally offered her a position coordinating the country's emergency response capabilities, and that her systematic analysis of complex problems, the very trait they had always seen as evidence of her impracticality, had just prevented a potential environmental catastrophe. She stepped outside the operations center and dialed her parents' number. Her mother answered on the second ring. Mija, how did your training go today? Did you finish the exercise you were working on? Mama, I need to tell you something. I'm not in Denver anymore. What do you mean? Where are you? I'm in Washington, D.C. The president asked me to coordinate the response to a national emergency, and he's offered me a permanent position with the federal government. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched long enough that Sarah began to wonder if the call had been dropped. Finally, her mother's voice came back, subdued and almost wondering. Sarah, are you serious? This isn't one of your brother's jokes? It's not a joke, Mama. The president read the analysis papers I wrote, the ones everyone said were too complicated and impractical. It turns out those papers demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking they needed to handle crises that don't fit standard protocols. But Mija, you were just taking a volunteer class. How did... It turns out that all those years when everyone said I was overthinking things and seeing problems that weren't really there, I was actually developing exactly the skills the country needs for situations like this. When Sarah finally ended the call with her parents, she felt something she had never experienced before. Not just pride in what she had accomplished, but a deep sense of vindication for everyone who had ever been dismissed as not quite good enough, not quite ready, not quite practical enough for the real world. As she walked back into the operations center, where teams of professionals were implementing the monitoring systems she had designed, Sarah realized that being labeled useless had actually been the best thing that could have happened to her. It had forced her to develop her own standards for success, to trust her own analytical abilities, and to persist in the face of constant criticism and doubt. The phone call from the president hadn't just changed her career. It had proven that sometimes the person everyone counts out is exactly the one who changes everything. Sometimes the skills that make you different are the skills the world needs most. And sometimes, being underestimated is the greatest advantage you can have. 6 months later, director Sarah Martinez would be featured on the cover of Time magazine as one of the most innovative emergency management professionals in the country. But even then, the thing she would be most proud of wasn't the recognition or the prestigious position. It was the knowledge that she had finally found a place where being herself, thinking systematically and seeing patterns others missed, wasn't just accepted but valued. The person everyone had labeled useless had become exactly who she was always meant to be.